the guidance and the confidence I needed to going forward. Very much appreciate, Elliott, your assistance really guiding me through a lot of experience.
What I realized is that for a searcher, one of the crazy things is if you think about how important buying right is, and if you listen to Warren Buffett or any great investor, they talk about you can make almost most of your money, if not all of it, on the buy. Well, that's wild because
I remember the first call we had, I was driving up to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin with my wife. And I said something around, I said something like, made some comment about emotional therapy or therapy, something like that. I think it's because I recognize I maybe got to the point where I realized there was a lot more here that I needed to understand that I didn't. I just recognized I did not know what I was doing. I didn't have 5 or 10 years to figuring this out. And just your confidence, your having been there, done that, and and acknowledging some of my comments. I think we started off with an email I sent out or just our conversation. I think too, as a series of emails I may have got thereafter that were educational, it reassured me I was on the right path. I think that's maybe the biggest thing is I was just fearful around the whole thing. And it would have been fear that was going to kill this. And so you just gave me the confidence and I felt, and even in nuanced things, it could be how to respond to something. It was just, maybe you could put that in the book of negotiation, but it really was articulating language that might resonate better with a seller or a broker. Or, one of your comments was, I know is, I think there's some truth there that how is it that this business has been on the market and I put an offer in and now there's a competing offer, right?
the same day.
And now they want me to negotiate with myself. And I remember one of your comments was just hold pat, let them come back to you. Do not pass go. So a lot of that is just know how. If you're going to get to 10, if you're going to get to closing, you want to collapse that as much as you can. And you really need a resource that you can trust in and can kind of guide you through that. And that's really where I felt that I got the most assistance from you.
Well, Tim, thank you for the kind words. I remember that first phone call. It touched me for a lot of reasons. I think partially because I knew your wife was like in earshot. And I could tell because I've been in your shoes where you're like, hey, I could do this myself or I could get some help. I may not know him well enough to trust him yet, but I think what he's charging is less than the value I'll get. And I still have a bunch of more steps to get to success that I'm uncomfortable with. And when people like you trust me, with some of their toughest investment decisions and sort of these nuanced moments and these moments where like how to handle this comment from the broker that the same day you put an offer in, there's another one. Sometimes I have to tell people like, hey, Tim, go dark for a week and you'll know. And you're like, wait, but he sent me an email, he called, it's like, go dark for a week and you'll know. And it's like those things that I've done 20 times. So I know, but I'm trying to give it to you. It made me uncomfortable at first, but you're like, hey, if I trust this person and the logic seems pretty sound, I think I'm gonna go with this, right? And what I gotta say about you is I'm so thankful that you closed the deal because we had talked about this particular one several times. And I don't know how many hours we spent between emails and phone calls over the past 2 years, but just it's such a heartwarming feeling to see someone who dedicated so much time and energy and got through so many hurdles to get to the finish line and then be smiling on the other side of it. Of course, you're working your behind off, but I think you won the game you were playing despite all of the hurdles and changes. And I just got to say congratulations, Tim.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's, kind of open up the discussion around the mindset of what search is like. You get so wired into this networking, always looking at deals. I also, I think I'd share with you, I put together a target list where I was actually cold calling at business owners, leaving a little flyer with them.
Yep.
Get into this circular mindset. You're like in a dream state, and you begin losing yourself. You begin forgetting who you are. So although I closed on the business doing a year ago, I still does not feel like I bought a business. Like you come because the search goes on for so long, you just believe that you're never going to get to closing. But you mentioned my wife. I am shocked. That I was okay with you. I knew she was going to support me from the beginning. You would think that a spouse, after maybe 6 months, maybe a year and a half, you would think at some point they'd start saying, "Hey, listen, what are you doing?" Yeah. Sheila was supportive the entire time. It shocks me to this day that she was so supportive. And I made a point of always getting up. If she's up at 6, I'm up at 6. Whatever time she's up. Just to make sure that she knows I'm not, this isn't semi-retirement. I'm not sleeping until 10 type of thing. So yeah, spouse is so important making this work as well. I very much appreciate, Elliott, your assistance in really guiding me through a lot of scenarios, how to look at things differently.
Yes, I do know. Search can suck. Yes.
Yeah, the way I've found it best to describe the process is it's a sales position, 0 leads, 24-month minimum sales cycle. And if we believe Stanford's numbers, 35% of those searching for 24 months will never close.
Yep.
And there's no positive feedback along the way. So you're going through the motions, a process that you're inventing as you're going, not sure if it's going to result in anything. Lonely because your friends and family have no idea what you're doing and why you're doing it. So you're on your own. So you're on your own to be doing this for 24 months with a fairly large opportunity to fail completely. And I mean, unless you close, you failed. So that's kind of what it's like.
And I think on the self-funded side, the numbers are more like 90. I've even heard as high as 97% of people don't close.
I can believe that. Yeah, there's a lot of Facebook groups with people kind of chiming in, and it seems to be the flavor of the month is this idea of, I want to buy a business. I'm going to buy a business this year. I'm going to do this roll up this year. Within 6 months, I'm going to buy 3 businesses. You know, these individuals have no idea what they're saying. And partly it's because there's nothing in our own consumer lives that compares to it. You know, the closest might be buying a car or buying a house. And this is on a completely different level.
Totally different. Let's touch on that for a second, because I speak on it, but you being fresh off will help. So most of the things that we try, buying a house, maybe you look at 10 or 20.
Yeah.
Going to get a new job, maybe you look at 5 or 10. Anything else that we've done of this magnitude, you're looking at numbers in that realm. But with search, you're probably looking at somewhere between 50 and 200 companies. I don't know. What was your experience? I know the one you closed, you looked at a couple of times. We talked about it a lot, but it wasn't the only one you looked at, was it?
No, I looked at upwards of 400 businesses, but granted, a lot of those could just be at the sim level, right? So I may not have dug down. I think I did financial modeling on about 40 to 45 of those.
Yep.
And maybe 15, 16, 17 LOIs.
So those are my numbers back in 2015 and 16. And I never say 400 because it scares people, but I know that's the number.
You know, the difference with someone selling a house or a car is it's what's replacing that old car. It's what's replacing that old house they're in, right? They're excited about the new community they're going to move into, or maybe it's for their children's a school system, or maybe they're going to be moving out of state. It's the excitement around that move is what has them recognizing the selling of the house is more of a transaction, very much like a car. There's that brand new car I got my heart set on. I got to get rid of this current car. But with their selling of a business, there's nothing replacing it. It just leaves a hole in their life. Their egos are so tied to it. It's emotional, especially if they're a founder. This is their baby. You know, letting go of that is very, very difficult. And there's nothing replacing it but this void called maybe retirement or the unknown. And I find a lot of people just choose to change their minds. They thought they wanted to sell and can't do it. Can't bring themselves to doing it.
Let's talk about that. My theory around it is that a seller will consider every other alternative to selling. And if you think I'm crazy, think about how tough due diligence is. It's like a proctological exam of a person who has created a freedom-oriented business and has earned the right to not ever have someone in their business like this. And then in today's environment, maybe it's some kid fresh out of MBA school Maybe it's somebody fresh off of a Facebook group is now showing up with a flashlight, a magnifying glass, and doing them like the doctor does at our physical, right? And so shutting it down, selling it to somebody else, selling it at a cheaper price to someone who doesn't want to do diligence, selling it only at a certain price or terms, not this year, next year. All those things enter the mind of a seller. I mean, speak on
Yeah.
your experience.
Yeah, that's spot on. And then as a searcher, you're trying to, you need information, but then you're also have to be sensitive to what you just said, which is if you overwhelm them with too much information requests, it becomes now a part-time job on top of their full-time job.
Yeah.
But then in the back of your mind, you're also reminding yourself that of a couple little sayings. One is time kills all deals,
Yes.
or deal fatigue. So now you're trying to say, all right, how fast can I push the seller to getting me information before these other two things, right? There's this intersection of things. And that's a fear that, I had even with Dynabur. That was a very real possibility. Probably what made this one a little bit more absorbable for the seller is that he was only working 4 days a week and was, he'd take a vacation maybe every other 2 to 3 months.
Mhm.
So he was getting, so my requests weren't unreasonable because he was already taking a day off a week. And then he was getting this constant refreshment, every other month from me through a vacation. But those are the situations you can't control when you're a searcher, that you're going to have a buyer like that.
And then let me just toss out a couple of things I want to talk about, and we can talk about them in any order. I want to talk about how long you were engaged with Dynabur, because I know it was a long time because you and I talked about it for a long time. I want to talk about, and you mentioned this on LinkedIn, kind of that first step out of 10 in the search process. I want to touch on that. And then I want to touch on, so the 10th module in my masterclass is bulldogging. And what I call it is just kind of like sometimes at the end, you got to just grab this freaking calf by the horn and drag it to the ground because it's your deal and you have to get past some unsavory things. I know there were some unsavory things in your pathway, so I wanted to touch on those 3 things. So maybe the first one that makes sense to touch on is your LinkedIn post. You said, hey, look, a lot of people are mastering step 1 out of 10 when there's like 9 steps behind it and they're still kind of nervous in step 1. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, again, search is something that the vast majority of people have never done before. Let's just say it's over 99% have never done search. In their mind, they're imagining a process along the lines of buying a house.
Yeah.
So maybe there's 5 variables, maybe 10 variables that they need to figure out, like what their credit is, speak with a lender around how much home they can afford, what those payments will be, finding a realtor, looking at some homes, having that realtor kind of educate them a little bit. That's about it. That's about the variables.
Mhm.
But when you're buying a business, you don't realize yet. And it's almost like maybe in their mind, they see that road that looks like that home buying road. And then there's a cloud in front of the rest of the road. And as they get through the cloud or the cloud begins to evaporate, all of a sudden you realize you're on your way to 20,000 feet here. And you don't realize it at the time you start. And that's when it begins to be overwhelming, realizing that the learning curve is huge. And not only is it a large learning curve, but you are never going to learn everything you need to learn or could be learned in the acquiring of a business. And I think that's where it just, in the time, you think it's going to be the short time, like buying a house.
Right.
It's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And you don't realize that, I mean, a year is
2 years.
unreasonable.
Yeah.
2 years is not unreasonable. So I think that part of it is that you get stuck at step 1, thinking you know what you know. And it isn't until you kind of get down the pathway and have conversations like with yourself that you begin to realize there's a lot more here that I need to understand. And so now anyway, in the beginning, you're kind of playing house. I call it playing house. It's
Yes.
right. Everyone's
Yes.
they're getting caught up in it's like a startup. If people want to do a startup business, they're excited around, a name, a website.
Yeah.
Should I incorporate?
That's my one pager. Look at me.
Yeah. I got to get business cards. I got to come up with my logo.
Announce it on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yeah. I got to, and it's, I got to reach out to some brokers. But again, they don't realize they're at zero. And this 10-step process is going to culminate in another year to 2 years from now. And that's when most people just don't have because they don't know that. They're not prepared for that. And I know I started searching, it may have been 6-7 years ago, and I did it for 6 months part-time, and I gave up. I got so discouraged because the response wasn't what I was hoping for, and I kind of gave up at that time. So yeah, it's a grind. It's something that people just they're not aware of it yet. Like, they don't know what they don't know.
And I struggle with this because part of the reason I came in the market with Guardian and now the Business Buying Masterclass is because I've been in this 15-year small deals before there was a class at Harvard, even though I went to Harvard. Mm-hmm. And what disgusted me was everybody coming in the market saying it was easy. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me?
Yeah.
Because not only is the process from a numbers perspective grueling, but Tim, isn't everybody in this process kind of incented to lie to you, to allow you to do a bad deal because they get paid?
Yeah, there's, I've said this a number of times that I would never actually recommend this process to any of my personal friends. And the reason is that it is so fraught with risk. It could be, and again, it's because people, for the most part, are not prepared for this. For example, they don't know how to review the financials.
That's
Even
right.
looking at a sim, you don't really, nothing jumps out at you. You don't have enough reps in to begin recognizing where the problems are at, or what makes a good business versus a bad business.
That's right.
I think for people that have never, I think that in my case, I did a fair amount of real estate investing in the past. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good precursor for buying a business, because you can begin to analyze at a simple level financials, how to determine market value. If I buy it at this, and then I have rehab costs, that's good. And then I'm going to have carrying costs. And then if I'm going to sell it, I'm going to have a realtor, and now the realtor is going to take a percentage on the back end. So be able to do some of those, that simple analysis. But again, there's probably 10 variables there in its simplest. With a business buying, there's thousands of variables. And that's what makes the learning curve that much more difficult.
So 10x the variables. And then what I realized is that for a searcher, one of the crazy things is, if you think about how important buying right is, and if you listen to Warren Buffett or any great investor, they talk about you can make almost most of your money, if not all of it, on the buy. Well, that's wild, because I've been in small deals for 15 years, and there's still people that have been at 30 that I look up to that still have more game than me. And then my clients come in and they've had 6 months, maybe a year and a half through real estate that's tangential. A lot of them stopped their W-2 Q4 last year, and they're just starting. And then even in their 2-year period, looking at their 200 to 400 deals, they still won't be an expert at the deal evaluation, deal closing, fundraising process. And then that's kind of wrought with the risk. But then their primary task is the one that you're in now. So now that you sit in the owner or the CEO seat, your biggest task, and the one that might last 5 years plus, is running a business, growing a business, managing a workforce, managing an ecosystem and a market. But you had to do the upfront thing good enough to get in the game, and to get in the game in a solid enough position not to be scraping the barrel trying to pay your SBA debt. And so it's crazy to me, because you're probably going to have to make an acquisition decision when you might only know 51%, 40% of what there is to know about buying a business. And that's really uncomfortable for anyone to deal with, but that's the reality of first-time buyers. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. There's too much messaging out there right now that speaks to own a boring business. And I forgot who went into that language about maybe around the word boring and the definition
Right.
of boring, but it's an excellent marketing. It's an excellent little choice of words that are used, because what it's doing is it's overly simplifying how simple this is, and that everyone can own a simple business. And I think, if you, I just I do not understand how someone, and this is common, where people have actually never managed people, they've
That's right.
never had P&L responsibility.
That's right.
They have never owned maybe real estate, but here they're going to go out and buy a business. I am very, very concerned around people that are trying to buy a business who really have no right to own a business, because it's going to bankrupt them. They will not understand. Like yesterday, I saw someone post to some group that said her and her sister just got laid off, and they have $200,000 available to invest in a business, and so they're going to buy a business in the next 6 months. Well, they've never managed a business before. They don't understand P&L. They have no idea what they're signing up for. And the other is, this is a very expensive proposition.
That's
This
right.
is not a shoestring type of activity. You have to understand it's very expensive. It's like along the lines of doing like a full length Ironman. I mean, a full length Ironman, people don't know about triathlons, but minimally you're going to spend $7,000-8,000 to participate in one Ironman event. If people knew that up front, I don't know if they would start. But
That's
in
right.
this case, the numbers are, they're 4 or 5 times that. So you have to understand that, and so either you have to be willing to pony that money up and engage people like yourself that can guide them to collapsing the time frame and help to mitigate some of the risk, or you're going to pay that money later, and it may result in never closing on a deal, or for sure it's going to take you a lot longer. And the worst case is you're going to find, like you said, you're going to buy a business that isn't economically viable, and you're going to go bankrupt. I've already seen 3 or 4 people posting some of these Facebook groups saying that they bought the business. I know you've heard the story 100 times,
Sure.
but they bought the business, and they're finding now that the tax returns and the P&Ls were fraudulent.
Yep.
And so now they're asking a Facebook group what their options are.
Right.
You're asking a group of people on Facebook what your options are. You're admitting you've got no legal representation. You're admitting
That's
that
right.
you never had a QOV done. You're admitting, somebody even says, well, if with seller financing, maybe there's some recourse on that. The person admitted, well, I should have done that. So there was no
Right.
seller financing. That was a worst case situation where that person's likely out of business today because of that. And I don't know how much was at stake, but it would have been considerable. So
You're typically betting enough to bankrupt yourself if you lose.
Yeah.
Almost by definition.
Mhm.
You're certainly wiping out half of your retirement. And then you made some great points. A lot of people are getting let go of jobs, meaning they weren't good enough to suffice what their boss needed. And now, as a to the world, they're going to go do something 100 times harder. I actually have a persona in my marketing stack of what kind of person that is. And typically they don't have the energy to get to the end because they didn't have the energy to stay on the job.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about, so I currently have a master class, but when you and I met, it was before this. So I had a pre-LOI program, which was sort of like my best shot to give one-on-one time, because I knew those cohorts and those Facebook groups were baloney. Because how are you going to ask 200 novices about these super nuanced things? But walk me through how you feel the pre-LOI program and our experience together helped, because we talked about Dynabear several times over the past couple of years.
Yeah. Well, you'd asked this a little bit earlier, and that is, what was the engagement with Dynaber. So I'll just kind of back up a little bit and say that because I was searching full time, I started with on-market businesses through brokers. Your typical biz buy sell. Didn't take but about 2 months to burn through everything that was on the market, and so I had a lot of time on my hands.
Okay.
And at some point, I came to realize that I needed between 8 and 10 businesses in my pipeline at all time. Meaning, I've submitted 8 to 10 NDAs with various parties, because 97, 98% of the time, you're waiting for information. And so,
Tim, can you say that again for the people in the back? Because when I say it, they don't want to listen to me. How many did you need to have in your pipeline at any given time?
I needed 8 to 10 as a full-time searcher. And if I had less than 6, I had too much time on my hands, because again, you're waiting all the time for information. So then I had to do a proprietary search to basically bump that number back up into that 8 to 10 range. Yeah, so I met Dynaber probably like around, if it's on market, the logic is that the broker has already started this relationship with that seller a year earlier, maybe more than that. So we're saying, hey, at this point, you're closer to closing because they've already kind of worked, have qualified the seller is ready to sell, and that the numbers should be right. So if you want to get the closing quicker, a broker listed one would logically speak to that.
Yes.
But then after I burned through all those, I had to go and look at off-market businesses. And now I'm starting at the very beginning with where a broker would have.
That's
so
right.
now the sales cycle is
research.
much longer.
Yep.
So yeah, I met Dynaber roughly around August of 2023.
Sounds about right.
I think I had an offer into them somewhere like around October, like September, October.
Yep.
The seller felt that he had some other options. You mentioned that they're going to explore other options. He had a nephew that was apparently interested in the business. He had a golfing buddy that was potentially interested in the business. So we lost contact for about 4 months. I reached back out February of 2024, and those options had gone away, and we picked up that dialogue again. I had to get all updated financials again. You know how it's just very time consuming.
Yep.
And then I had another new offer to him somewhere in May, and then my offer got accepted in May sometime, and then began due diligence.
But then one of the things that you came to me with was there was a hurdle that also paused you for a while, because when we talked at one point, there was like an environmental or something of that nature, something with the real estate that almost derailed it. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. So the nature of this business, they do plating. So they're basically coating small parts in corrosion resistant material like a zinc, for example. But the seller had told me that they don't generate any hazardous waste. There's no hazardous water in their disposal. There's nothing hazardous in the solid waste that's taken off to a landfill. But I don't come from this industry. So I just trusted him that, okay, there's nothing hazardous about the nature of the work. I had, shortly after getting the signed LOI, I had spoken with an attorney. The attorney said, you should ask them for any interactions they've had with any environmental workup that they had done. For example, when this current seller had bought the real estate, likely he would have had some environmental work done, or any interactions with the Illinois EPA, the EPA, or in the Chicagoland area, there's the Water Reclamation District. It's who handles the wastewater.
Okay.
But he proceeds to send me a whole bunch of files, and sure enough, there are some historical hazardous related work that has been done in the past. So now I now realize that I need to, the real estate's a part of this deal at some point. So I need to go out, and my lender is saying I need to get a phase 1 and a phase 2 environmental work. If you're going to purchase the real estate as part of the deal, your lender is always going to require a phase 1 and a phase 2. So now I had to engage a company to do that. Took them 5 weeks to do phase 1, took another 3 or 4 weeks to do phase 2. My attorney also said, hey, you don't come from this industry. you probably should engage somebody that can audit the business from a compliance perspective, meaning because of their discharge, they need to have licenses. Do they have the right licenses? Are the licenses current? Are they adequate? Are they current on their licenses? Had they been filing all this stuff? Well, again, this isn't the industry I come from, so I had to engage another consultant that spent then the next 5 or 6 weeks just doing a compliance audit to verifying these matters. So all of that added another, let's see. And then I was afraid to do them in parallel because I was expecting, let's do the phase 1, phase 2 first, because if that uncovers something of significance or a red flag,
there's no need to do the other one.
Let's do the deal right now. I'm only out of pocket this much money. But what ended up happening over time is, going back to our earlier conversation, is I felt like this is getting stretched out too long. If the seller gets discouraged by the fact of how long this is taking, he could kill the deal.
The seller, and that's equally as disastrous.
Yeah, that's just as bad. So then I decided,
the catch-22, right? Because you could have done, if you could have done the environmental and the compliance audit simultaneously, you'd have put more money on the table and risked it, but less deal fatigue. Alternatively, you could be sequential, which most people are. I don't want to spend the money, which isn't a crazy thought process. But then in the back of your head and your heart and your body, you're like, but am I losing my seller? Because he can kill this deal too. And you don't know. Because when deals get killed by sellers who are tired, it happens on a Tuesday. And you get some random crazy email or call from the broker. And if you can't close in like 3 or 4 days, you're stuck.
Right. And earlier, before I submitted that most recent LOI to them, the seller, I knew for those 4 months, he wasn't quite sure about the valuation. So he had gone out and engaged a larger brokerage firm to put together a valuation.
Of course.
So he's got this valuation, which is fine. But in the back of my mind, I also know they're trying to win his business.
That's right.
So I've got a competitor in this whole process. So if I'm taking too long, maybe in the minds of the seller, minimally that broker is going to be telling them, what is your buyer doing? Why is your buyer wasting all this time? He shouldn't have taken all these months. So I'm also feel under the pressure to getting this deal done before some of these other parties weigh in heavily on the minds of the seller. So yeah, these are all the challenges. But yeah, due diligence was about almost 5.5 months was my due diligence process.
So that's an incredible story. It also talks about how raw even a proprietary search can be with hazards, because what you're basically saying is that during the proprietary search, after your seller had a signed LOI with you, he essentially went against exclusivity and shopped the deal to a broker. Now, maybe he stopped short of hiring a broker to take it back to market, but he certainly did everything up until the point of shopping the deal on the same websites you had looked at 8 months prior and decided to stop, right? That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So I made that initial offer back in maybe October, and that's when he still thought he had some other alternatives. We picked back up in February, and at that point he didn't feel like he had any options. And so I had a signed LOI by the end of May. But I should say between February, he had engaged a broker to do a valuation. It was just for the purpose of valuation, not representation.
Okay.
It took that broker another month, 5 weeks, 6 weeks to do the actual appraisal. And it was based on that he and I came to an agreement on the valuation and what my LOI that got accepted late May represented. But I know, though, that the broker doesn't make as much money on just an appraisal. They would really like the listing. So he wasn't actively shopping it, in my estimation. Sure. But I know he had a broker in his ear the whole time, right? And I know that's what I was on a timeline to prevent that broker from having any meaningful damage done to my process.
So you have to be a deal champion at that point, I'm sure, and have some conversations with your seller that, hey, anybody else is going to have to go through the same phase 1, phase 2 compliance audits. I'm 30 to 60 days from closing. You're 6 months to 12 with the broker. So now you're playing offense on one side, right?
Yeah.
And playing defense on the other. In a process, you're still learning as you play the game.
you spend most of your time at the top of the funnel. So if we illustrate those 10 steps as looking like a funnel working down the funnel, you spend 99% of your time at the top of the funnel, which is just looking at deals. And then you only work down the funnel when you put together an LOI, which is not as well, no, financially, you maybe do a modeling. Financial modeling might be the next thing that you do. And then of the financial modeling, if you find that there's an opportunity to put together an LOI, you're now further down in the funnel.
That's right.
Getting an accepted LOI is at the very bottom, which is now I'm going to call it the less than 1%.
That's right.
And then due diligence is that, 0.25% of what you're doing. So the problem is the further down the funnel you get, you find that you have less reps.
Yes.
And so you find yourself always in more and more murkier waters that your experience doesn't play to. So it's very, you get really good at looking at sims. Yeah, you get really good at that. Right. And then thereafter it gets more and more difficult because the frequency that you need the skills to know how to put together an LOI becomes less, or if it gets accepted, if your LOI gets accepted, now you're in due diligence, and now hopefully you're not going to do but one, because it is so expensive, right? So you hope that you can do diligence and you'll get to closing on the one. Otherwise, you're going to have some serious dead deal costs.
So just to summarize, let's say you look at 100 deals to make the numbers simple. I think you said about, let's go 7 you do modeling on. Let's say you get 2 to 3 LOIs signed, and let's say 1 kind of passes that first week sniff test of diligence. So what you're saying is, you're 100 times good at looking at sims. You're 7 times good sort of doing models. You're 3 times good at negotiating LOIs and doing that first week of diligence after. And then you're 1 time with the most amount of money on the table, with the personal guarantee looming, with seller fatigue, so do I just close this thing and figure stuff out after, all looming on your brain as you do a one-of-one thing that's also probably the biggest and most volatile investment you've ever made.
Right. Plus, in most cases, there's a broker involved, and that broker is going to be chirping in your ear. You don't need this. It's a good business, right? So they're cheering you on as you are in this murky, cloudy part of the process, and where all the risk is at. And you can see why people tend to back out. They're fearful because they can't ever get warm up to the opportunity, or they don't have the experience to recognize that this is an awesome business. The advantage I had, this is very unusual, is that from the moment the seller accepted my LOI, he actually announced to the organization that he was selling the business, and he introduced me as the likely buyer of the business. If there was a broker involved, there's no way that he would
that would have happened.
He would never let him do that, right? The other thing is he allowed me access on site as much as I wanted, and I tried again to be sensitive to his needs. So I was only on site maybe 1 day a week, but I had free access to everyone here. So I took people out for lunch. I got to ask every and all questions I had. I was doing time studies. So it allowed me to warm up. So here we are, as you're saying, that one deal, I'm in due diligence, but I'm able to warm up to the deal more because I have more access to the people than the seller. He was very transparent. Everybody was very transparent, but that is a very, very unusual situation. I don't think I've ever heard of any other. Well, very rare is that a seller will make that announcement and then provide a buyer access to their people, which would then alleviate the buyer's risk and uncertainty. But that's the vast majority of what people are in for.
And the times that I've seen it done, and I work on probably 50 deals a year with searchers, is when the seller is trying to pull a fast one to get the buyer to fall in love with the business because there's a monkey wrench in it that he's hoping that his lovey-dovey appearance will mask the stench from what he's trying to pull over. And I just had 2 QOE deals that fell apart after someone had been announced as the new owner, after somebody had spent a week on site, after all these things. But I can understand the psychology again to just let people know that you're kind of always head on a swivel, because the same love somebody might show you may be masking something or hoping you overlook, right? So it's great to get the kind of access you got. And yours is a bit different because I think a week on site is not the same as 1 day a week over an extended period of time. I also think that the messaging and the signaling that a seller is giving you when he says, hey, just come on site and talk to anybody, I don't need to be in the conversations, it exudes, I'm not hiding anything, in a way that no other verbal thing or written thing can do.
Right. And the other thing too is, it's like dating, I mean, you can't date someone one time and then say, this is the right person to marry them. You need to see that person in different settings, maybe different times of the day, maybe different events. So like, you see that, you hear these stories all the time. A seller says he's absent. He only works, 20 hours a week.
Right.
Right. And you learn over time that the longer a business has been on the market, the more sophisticated the seller has gotten. They've learned what buyers are looking for.
That's right.
So if the business has been on the market for a while, I'm more sensitive to, okay, they've been trained and coached by a broker. But in this case, I was on site so often and in such conversation with the seller that I got to see exactly what his schedule was. I mean, if he's taking a 1-week vacation,
right,
and I know he's not here, well, then I know he's not here. Or if I drive by on a Friday, because he says he takes every Friday off and his car's not here,
that's right.
well, I know he's not here. So you have to have an interaction to basically validating some of these beliefs that we come to have. The worst ones I heard is someone claiming the owner worked 30 hours a week, took ownership of the company, and found actually the guy was working 80 hours a week. But that's the current owner. But to a buyer, if you're going to do 80 hours a week, you're spending 115 hours, 120 hours a week to do what
covering his 80. That's
to
right.
do his 80. So that meant that in that case, they had to hire two people or maybe 3 people, which they had not budgeted for, to covering the work of the seller. Well, all of a sudden, the business went from making money to making no money because they made.
I was just telling somebody about this today. I was talking to someone over the weekend about a QOE, and they were thinking about doing a cheap version versus mine is the more good than cheap. We're not super expensive, but we're not the cheapest on the market. And I told them about somebody who I had done a QOE for like 2 or 3 years ago. We ended up killing that deal, or they killed the deal based on our QOE. They did another deal, decided to go with somebody else, which I understand it happens sometimes. And then they bought the business and then called me, hey, you have this Guardian Grow program. Can you help me sort of grow this business? Well, here's the QOE that I got from the other person. So 2 weeks into like a 6-month process, Tim, we find out that what was told in the sim was that the seller was spending 10 hours in the business. The seller was actually doing 24/7 dispatch, invoicing, sales, management of resources, and everything. And so by the time my Guardian Grow client rehired even international Filipino resources to cover it, he went from a non-zero $250,000-ish SDE to 0, to the point where he was going in to his savings to pay the SBA debt. And so now going cheap on diligence, and cheap isn't just money spent, but you spent time, which is expensive. If you don't spend a good amount of time, money, resources on diligence, what you get into is you bought a break-even business, and as a multiple of cash flow, it have no value. You paid $1 million for it, and there's no takebacks. There's no customer service line like at Walmart. You have to figure yourself out of it.
And that's why I cannot imagine someone buying a business that actually hasn't been a manager, managed people, and understand financials, because once you go in the business, the immediate issues are operational issues. And if you're looking at a business as an outsider, as a potential buyer, you won't have that sense, that feel for recognizing this guy's working 20. Why does this guy have bags under his eyes? How come I call here at 5 a.m. and the guy's here? Why is he always picking the phone up? But if you're not good at recognizing that as kind of like an innate sense, you're going to make a mistake because you can't consciously pick up on those subtleties like that.
Sure.
It's just the risk. I can't. Yeah.
You bring
kept
up
me
a
up.
really good point.
It kept me up and up thinking about other people trying to buy a business like that.
I want to like triple click on this. So Tim, who's a more experienced professional than most of the people that come to me, who has run businesses, made real estate investments, so a more informed investor, it's keeping him up at night. Whereas some of my folks that have not managed people, have not made kind of open air investments, right? They don't get as scared because the marketplace has told them it's easy. So the more naive practitioners are less nervous than the more seasoned ones who have a better view on some of the risk profiles. And then to your point, some of the things you have to check for, you wouldn't even know to check for had you not been the person that at least ran a P&L, a group of people. Had you not been the person with bags under your eyes, answering the phone at 5 a.m., you're telling your boss you're working 40 or 60 because you don't want to seem like you're just going crazy, but you're working 80. If you don't understand the signs, it'd be almost impossible to diligence those things.
Yeah, it's just in my case, I was able to, because I was on site so much. I would literally just, they had like a butcher block table out in the back. I would just sit up on that butcher block table, and I'm just watching the flow of people, the flow of work. I'm just trying to absorb. Did anything jumping out at me as that doesn't make sense? Or I actually started videotaping some of the workflow of one order. This is in a factory setting.
Smart.
So I put together kind of a observation. Where's the constraint at? Where's the flow? Why is this guy killing himself? Right? Drawing some conclusions, but it's just through observation. But I can do that because I've been doing this for decades. The only thing that makes me feel good though about, although the vast majority of people should not buy a business, what makes me feel good about the fact that they'll never find themselves in a situation is that the hurdle to buying a business is so high that they will never end up getting to that point. It's a rare person that's ever going to get to that point that shouldn't have bought a business. I've seen now 2 or 3 on these Facebook groups that kind of speak to that. I saw one person speak to that on one of the Will Smith's episodes. A woman bought a business in Wisconsin. It just killed me listening to her, because she's like, "Hey, I found there's actually a company that will actually find you staff." She says, "Yeah, they're called like a staffing agency, and then it's like, but then it's $5,000 a person, and then so I had to hire 3 people. I mean, but the problem now is it was $15,000." And she says, and they'll guarantee him for 30 days. Unfortunately, I fired all 3 of them. Right? Doesn't even.
Welcome to the jungle.
She's never even hired anyone in her life. This is her first hiring. She doesn't even know that there's an agency that can place people. She doesn't know that this is a normal cost to doing so. She doesn't even understand that if you terminate them outside the guarantee, that they're not going to get replaced for that. That was just one example. She spoke about probably 10 things that I'm like, she should never want this business, right?
There's been a couple of good podcasts. Will Smith does a great job on acquiring minds of getting folks to talk about their processes. Justin Willis was on in the fall, and he bought about a $10 million construction business, didn't do a QOE, regrettably, and ended up losing it. And I ended up doing a follow-up discussion with Justin and got a double click on the diligence piece of it. And he was forthright with a lot of great information. But to your point, only the real ones listen to that, right? Because it's not the glossy, easy, boring business stuff. This is the detail, how not to get screwed book. And only the real ones spend the time there. But you're right that I feel a lot better generally about the business acquisition ecosystem because it's so difficult that only people with incredible persistence, which almost by definition forces an education while you're doing it, get to the end, right?
Yeah. It's those that I think are also, it's also too, where do you seek your information from? Very common question. You mentioned QE, is you see this oftentimes asked. This business is under $1 million purchase price. Should I get a QE done?
Right.
And it's the wrong question to be asking.
That's right.
can you afford to lose $1 million?
And you lose $1 million.
And it also speaks to people. It also suggests that people are, again, trying to do this on a shoestring budget
Yes.
and are not prepared to do what really needs to be done on little deals. They don't really care really you just have to ask yourself the question, do I feel lucky that this whole business isn't going to go under and I lose all of it because I didn't want to pay for a QB? That's really the better question. But people saying, oh, under $1 million, you don't have to do that. I think that's bad advice. You're not telling them really what they need to understand here.
Probably the shift in the market I'm most proud of, Tim, was when I first kind of get into the socials around Guardian, and that was probably 2020, 2021. It was widely accepted on Twitter, which is one of the bigger networks of folks that are doing small business deals, that under $2 million, it wasn't economical to do a QOE. And, you get into these debates as a QE provider, like, yeah, Elliott, why are you doing QOEs on deals under $2 million? And I come from lower middle class, barely middle class, depending on what part of my upbringing you want to talk about. I'm like, you can lose $1 million? Does your wife stay with you if you lose $1 million? Do you keep your kids in the same kind of schools and situations? Lose $1 million?
Do you lose it all?
Do you lose a decade digging out of that crap? Because I'll tell you, the people who get hit with these bankruptcies, they spend 10 years digging out, meaning they could have saved themselves 10 years of peril by just not doing a bad deal. And then it's like, with these first-time buyers, $200,000 is more than they can lose, let alone $1 million. I deal with a lot of people. Like last year, I helped a caterer buy an auto body shop. Like this is a person that's not making a whole bunch. They take that hit. That could be 20, 30 years digging. Do they have 20, 30 more years of working life in them?
Right. Yeah, and I did. This was just, it does. It just scares me thinking about people that are not qualified to be buying a business. Not only just skipping steps, not recognizing the red flags. Worst case, they buy themselves a business, and you could just see the questions that people ask. The questions that people ask reveals how naive they are around the business as a general conversation.
That's right. Well, Tim, it's been a pleasure both working with you, and now I thank you so much for spending this time with me. Shout out to Sheila. Please tell her I said hello. Hey man, have a great week, Tim. I'll talk to you
too. Thank you so much.